Welcome to the Art of Climate Dialogue Stories from Iowa, produced by myself, Vivian M. Cook, and the Eco Theater Lab. And welcome to today's conversation with artist, farmer, and food sovereignty and rematriation specialist, Shelley Buffalo.
So this poem I wrote actually the same evening after getting back from Standing Rock. This was December of 2016. 4 days in Ocheti, Shakowin. The moon and stars above Standing Rock, undiminished by the aggressor's strobes, remind us of the infinity that cannot be bought, my love. We laughed when our little recon warriors, the bee-buzzing drones, smaller than your backpack, my love, made mockery of the circling helicopter, attempting to intimidate. That damn helicopter, haha. Day and night, its futile track above our heads failed to drown out the calls of migrating geese and the voices singing around the drum. In that river basin of poor cell signal and low or dead batteries, I forgot the lighted screen and remembered the beauty of authenticity in your face, my love. In the center of the universe, we felt all the suffering of humanity and took courage in loving kindness. My love, on the hill where I screamed out all of my despair, you hugged me tight, even though we did not know each other before. Men and women wept openly, then laughed loudly, giving a child a piggyback ride up a sledding hill. As the Buddha faced Mara, we face brutality with a pledge of no harm, the medicine of Standing Rock.
Addressing climate change is urgent, but in order to move toward action, we first have to find ways to talk about climate change with one another. The Art of Climate Dialogue, Stories from Iowa, is a podcast series featuring 13 conversations with artists, farmers, community-engaged researchers, and community organizers and activists who have all used arts and storytelling strategies to talk about climate change and agriculture. Through this podcast, they generously share these strategies so that listeners can implement them in their own communities. I'm Vivian, and I invite you to explore the art of climate dialogue with me. As we enter into these conversations around climate action, sustainable agriculture, and community-engaged arts in Iowa, the Eco Theater Lab and I want to first recognize that Indigenous nations have been leaders in such conversations for centuries and continue to be today. Iowa now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. Iowa is now situated on the homelands and trading routes of the Iowa, Meskwaki, and Sauk, Oto, Omaha, Ihanktawa, and Santee. And because history is complex and time goes far back beyond memory, we also acknowledge the ancient connections of many other Indigenous peoples here. The history of broken treaties and forced removal that dispossess Indigenous peoples of their homelands was and is an act of colonization and genocide that we cannot erase. And as a result, Indigenous ecosystems within Iowa have suffered from extraction, degradation, and unsustainable agricultural practices, contributing to the ongoing climate crisis. Understanding and addressing these injustices is critical as we work toward climate dialogue, action, and justice in our communities. My thanks to podcast interviewees Shelley Buffalo, enrolled member of the Meskwaki tribe, Lance Foster, enrolled member and tribal historian of the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sakawis Nobis, Plains Cree Soto of the George Gordon First Nation, for their collaboration in developing this acknowledgement. Shelley Buffalo lives on the Meskwaki Settlement with her 2 sons. The Meskwaki Settlement is Shelley's home and community. She says, "Wherever I may wander, my path winds back home to my community along the Iowa River. I'm drawn back again and again because this is where I belong and who I belong to. The Meskwaki culture formed me into who I am today. Some of that formation was harsh, and some was loving. I may be middle-aged now, yet I am still a child when it comes to my cultural education. Yet if there is one thing that I can do in my lifetime that is meaningful, it is to interrupt colonization by staying committed to my own Meskwaki cultural development. Everything I do and say is measured by what my elders have taught and continue to teach me." The Meskwaki are unique in that their land-based community is a settlement, not a reservation. Established in 1857 with the purchase of 80 acres near Tama, Iowa, the Meskwaki Settlement has grown to over 8,600 acres. Visit meskwaki.org to learn more about the Meskwaki, and I'm excited to share Shelley's and my conversation with y'all today. Welcome to the podcast, Shelley, and thanks so much for inviting me to your home today for our conversation. We're sitting here, and for listeners, we're looking out on incredibly beautiful trees with the snow and the sun glinting off them. It's really lovely.
Yes, and you need to remember the Iowa River down there.
Yes, in the Iowa River. I'm going to have to actually go look at it, I think, before I leave. So you just read a poem that you wrote after attending protest at Standing Rock several years ago. Can you tell us more about that experience?
So first and foremost, this was in 2016. So this was after Trump was elected, but before he took office. And in the meantime, there was, this basically disaster, not disaster, but so much as it's a incredible environmental and humanitarian crisis unfolding, with the Dakota Access Pipeline crossing through treaty land and definitely, under the waterway, the Missouri River, and how that was putting all the communities, tribal communities, and all the other communities that depend upon the Missouri, including, the ecological communities, at risk, because these pipelines, they break. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah.
With all of these pipelines, they are not the answer to sustainable energy. Quite the opposite. But yet they persist because of, the oil industry is just so powerful. Ultimately, like, the type of crimes against humanity that were being committed at Standing Rock were atrocious. Before I went there, I remember watching video footage of water protectors having flash grenades fired at them, having rubber bullets fired at them, as well as like a water cannon sprayed upon them in sub-zero, or I think it was sub-freezing. I think it was 20-degree weather. And these were nonviolent water protectors. And I say water protectors rather than protesters. Not that protester is a bad word, even though I think in American kind of popular culture, there's been a lot of propaganda to make protester a bad word. Right. Even though this is part of the democratic process, is that there needs to be dissent. And especially in a capitalistic system, the political and social dissent is the only thing that keeps the system remotely honest. And, I couldn't help but want to be there. And, I felt like, I was seeing all of the video footage and the photographs and all of the reports come in. And, my heart was just getting ripped open because, I wanted to do something. Like, I wanted to do my part. But also, I had 2 school-age children at home.
Yeah.
And I'm a single mother, largely unsupported. So I really wasn't in a situation where I could just drop everything and take off to Standing Rock. I had a mortgage to pay, student loans to pay, of course, my children to care for. I couldn't be out there for an extended period of time, so I was only out there for 4 days. But it was enough. It was enough, especially to see the situation. You know, this is the militarization of the police. It's just like, who is paying for all these planes and helicopter and the Humvees and you know, just all of the weapons? The resistance was faced with just a lot of heavily militarized brute force, as well as intimidation and like counterintelligence tactics. And a lot of folks that were occupying that space out there for an extended period of time, they had to travel up to Bismarck for supplies. And even at Bismarck, you know, just to make a supply run for groceries, gas, whatever, you know, a lot of people had to navigate like a gauntlet of hostility from the locals. Extremely, extremely racist and extremely indoctrinated locals who really saw indigenous people as less than human, and the indigenous fight for, you know, the basic right to clean water as anti-American.
That's awful.
Yeah. And so it was, you know, it was definitely a life-changing experience for me. I mean, Standing Rock, period, you know, really galvanized folks. You know, it's, yes, it's like the, you know, fight against pipelines, but ultimately it is the fight against basically corporate dominance.
Right.
Of everything, of our world, to the point of our imminent destruction.
The forces behind what are investing in the technology and means to continue to exacerbate the climate crisis and all of the injustice, social and environmental, that comes with it.
You know, and it's bigger than that. The European patriarchal Christian base just way of thinking about this earth, you know, that is, you know, basically, you know, as man's dominion, which is diametrically opposed to the indigenous understanding of, you know, human life on this earth,
right,
as a part of the whole.
And I know today we want to talk about that in particular, this difference between narratives of our relationship with the environment and how we treat the environment, and how that's directly connected to whether we're going to find a way to heal those relationships. So we'll talk about that more. In terms of your experience at Standing Rock, I am curious how you and the fellow water protectors who were there, how did you use artistic strategies to bring attention to water protection and climate justice?
You know, my art, you know, when getting back home, then this poem and reflecting upon that experience, and then starting to engage first with Indigenous Iowa, which then, you know, Indigenous Iowa was dissolved, and later, you know, folks that were involved with Indigenous Iowa, some of those folks went to form Great Plains Action Society. So that relationship with, you know, with organizations that were very involved in this resistance, like one of the first things that I did was take part in an art pop-up. And so I did some screen printing, which was, you know, I just loved it. I made a design for a t-shirt that I felt like spoke to kind of like the political climate at the time.
How did art making, such as the development of this poem, help you process that experience individually and with friends and community members?
Yeah, and like the graphic for the printmaking and things
Right.
like that. Well, I mean, it helped me as an individual to process everything that was going on, like ultimately to overcome my own personal feelings of just helplessness, right? Of being just adrift in this incredible, powerful tide of environmental destruction and of environmental exploitation and extraction, which also was, the exploitation and extraction of humankind, specifically, BIPOC folks. So this is why, writing and making music and the visual arts, the graphic arts, playwriting and even dance, like, the performing arts and all of that. This is why it's so important that people engage in their art to raise awareness. Because if you're just depending on the current system, it's just not going to get out there.
Right.
But also what art does is it inspires. Instead of just a news report, which is kind of factual and cut and dry. And before we started this interview, both you and I were talking about how difficult it is to read. Our attention spans are now, shorter than they've ever been, and sitting down and reading a book or reading an in-depth investigative report or anything like that. It's challenging. Like, a lot of the media that we're just getting in little short, snack size bites through social media now.
Yeah.
That's where we're getting the bulk of our information. And so with art, that is a way to convey, especially through, non-written material, through images, through performance, through these other channels, to convey that message, to grab that narrative.
Right. You have quite a bit of work that you've done in food sovereignty and rematriation. You're a food sovereignty and rematriation specialist. How would you say that the work that you've done as a visual artist is connected to your work in food sovereignty?
Well, in working like food sovereignty, local food system, local economies, community building, all of that is interconnected. And so what's really important in doing that work is that it requires a lot of outreach. It requires a lot of, once again, getting that message out there. And even like when you have a beautiful graphic or an eye-catching graphic, it catches people's interest. It draws their attention to it. And it also, I think especially with, the visual arts, there's kind of a iconography that lights up parts of the human brain and makes that connection. We are very much a species that symbolism and iconography is very embedded in the way that we interact with our world. And so the visual arts definitely is not only a powerful way, but a really fun way. When you put together a graphic, even if it's something like, we're having a community meal or, or we're having, we're teaching, we're having a canning workshop or whatever, it draws in that interest. It's just part of that outreach package, when you're doing this work within your community.
In another interview, you also talked about farming and seed keeping as artistry in and of itself. Can you talk more about that?
You're living your art because you're living in a way that's artful and intentional. And once again, from an Indigenous perspective, you are living your life in a good way, right? According to, our traditional knowledge and values and practices. When I was coordinating media to put in the Chicago Field Museum Meskwaki pod, the new updated display there, that opened last May. In an interview with Jonathan Buffalo, he said, what we are taught, and this is like teachings from our Creator, is that if you have a good garden, if you are taking care of your garden, then you're taking care of your life. But if you're neglecting your garden, not getting in there and, just taking care of it, like tending to your garden, then it shows that you're not taking care of your life, And I think that's what it boils down to. Really, like when you are growing and gathering your own food, in doing so, that is connecting you to the earth. That's connecting you to, life. Our relationship with these seeds, indigenous folks see these seeds as our relatives. We have our own narratives about each of these plants, about the seeds, where they came from, how they came to us. And it's always from a type of understanding of interdependence of all life. And within that is like literally, we are taught that these are our relatives. When I really grasped that and held these ancestral seeds in my hand, it was just so powerful, because I'm like, these seeds connect me to my ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm.
These seeds connect me to my grandmothers. Our Meskwaki corn, we've had those seeds for over 3,000 years.
Wow.
And colonization, especially of North America, dates back to the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about, 300 years, right? And so in being a seed keeper, in being a food rematriator, right, in engaging in this ancestral food work, it's transcendent. We are still here. These foods are still here. Earth is still here. These relationships are still here. And the apocalypse that is colonization is but, a blip.
You and I have talked about how shifting the narrative about this relationship that humans have with agriculture, and agriculture as part of the larger ecological system that we're all a part of, how shifting that narrative is one of the most important things we need to do when talking about climate action and climate justice. So can you talk a little bit about what you see as the dominating colonizing narrative right now, who controls that narrative, and what we need to start to do to change it?
Ultimately, like, big ag and big oil are kind of like just, I think, different sides of the same face.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so. There's not one without the other.
Right.
And especially, when you look at post-World War II, that's when agriculture really shifted in the United States to largely chemical dependent systems. And that's just because, like, all of these wartime chemicals,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, chemicals that were literally used for warfare, and the factories that produce them, the United States needed to figure out, like, all right, we've invested so much in this, like, we need to find another use for it. And so they applied it to agriculture. And it's big, it's powerful. That system controls, here in Iowa, it controls policy, it controls the government, just every aspect of how Iowans farm and our economies is completely controlled and manipulated by these corporations.
And it's a story they're telling, right? That is perpetuated. And we talked about perpetuated too by white supremacy and misogyny, and how all of these social injustices are completely wrapped up in the perpetuation of those narratives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to even talk about just because it's so far reaching and so pervasive. And, ultimately what it boils down to is, environmental injustice.
Yeah.
Because the folks that always take the brunt, always pay the price, are, the underserved communities. And even globally, it's the communities in the global south that have contributed the least, even like nominally,
Yeah.
to carbon pollution, are the ones that are bearing the brunt. And of course, like in the cities, like in the Pacific Northwest, they've had these terrible heat waves, and the neighborhoods, the poorer neighborhoods, don't have shade. They don't have green spaces. They're lacking in, central air systems and such, including even like places to go to cool off. They just don't even have those. They don't even have third spaces in their neighborhoods, right? Think of, like, heck, a Starbucks. that has air conditioning where you can go and cool off. They don't even have, things like that in their neighborhoods. And so they're just left to like suffer, and some of them die. I mean, their neighborhoods are several degrees hotter than the wealthy neighborhoods. I mean, you can just go on and on and on and on with examples of that, basically environmental racism. But ultimately, just once again, just the very extractive and destructive practices of corporate farming, of the oil industry, of so much industry, even, the renewable industries, like, the lithium mines. Who's mining that stuff? And where are those mines? For all of these batteries that are going to go into electric cars. It is so violent and so destructive. But yet, like, your average American citizen is really kept in the dark.
Yeah.
A week ago, I was in Des Moines for Martin Luther King prayer breakfast. And then we had some roundtable discussions about environmental justice after the prayer breakfast. And I was asked to facilitate one of the table discussions. And it was frustrating because, like, we couldn't even like really discuss solutions because I was just sitting there at the table trying to get people to understand what the people that are the most exploited in this model. I was just like, who is it that I said, we just had sausage this morning, and some folks would say, oh yeah, CAFOs. I said, yes, they're, factory farms are very destructive. And like all of those hogs coming out of those farms, who is processing that? Do you think about those folks? Do you remember when COVID first hit and, the folks that worked in this industry were having the highest numbers of fatalities, from COVID infections? Like our hospitals, University of Iowa Hospital, their medical ICU ward were flooded with patients from the Waterloo facility. And by the time they got to the medical ICU, there wasn't much that can be done for them. They were so sick and so far gone. It's interesting because, these folks are in these processing facilities, which they used to be called slaughterhouses. But they were in, with COVID, they were in a slaughterhouse of humanity.
Right.
And some of the managers were actually taking bets on how many of their workers were going to die. And so where does that come from? Where does that like energy come from that, you don't even see these people as human beings? Where does that come from?
I think that's where it starts, is what we talked about earlier, right? That we have to figure out where that comes from. And it comes from the stories we're telling about who matters and what matters, what kind of life has value. And
yeah, because there's nobody telling their narrative.
Right. And you said in that meeting in Des Moines that it was hard to even just get people on the same page and even just have a baseline understanding of how social and environmental justice and moving toward an agricultural system that pushes against climate change, that those are all connected and people aren't on the same page about that. How do you see artistic and storytelling strategies potentially being used as a way to help people get on the same page, as a way to connect and communicate a different narrative? And what you talked about, amplifying indigenous narratives that center relationships based in reciprocity and community and rematriation versus the current narratives that are centered in colonization, extraction, and exploitation. How can arts and storytelling techniques help us shift those narratives?
Well, ultimately, it's engaging hearts and minds. It's very powerful. because you're not telling, you're showing.
Right.
Like in the creative writing classes, over and over again, always your professor is telling you, like, don't tell people the story, like, you need to show.
Mm-hmm.
And when you show somebody, the story, you are drawing them in, right? You are getting them to experience it on some level.
Have you seen that work starting to happen in Iowa?
It is. You and I both just recently attended the Practical Farmers of Iowa conference, and Great Plains Action Society. That was the first year that Great Plains attended, as an organization, and in addition to that, tabled there.
Mm-hmm.
And so on that table was posters and stickers, postcards, and zines that had really powerful graphics and art, really beautiful artwork. And the response from attendees to the conference was overwhelmingly positive.
Mm-hmm.
We were hearing so many people saying, like we really appreciate, that you're here and that you're here conveying this message,
Mm-hmm.
because this is needed. This is really needed. This is a farming conference. And PFI, as an organization, because, this is Iowa, and because they are serving a large demographic that is, I don't know, like a lot of that demographic is not only white, is not only male, but there's a good portion of that demographic that's also conservative. And so their organization, it doesn't behoove them to engage in really direct action and direct conversations about big ag and big oil. And so GPAWS is, this is what they do. And so taking up space and being part of the narrative, putting that narrative out there, representing that, is greatly needed. And folks really appreciated it, like overwhelmingly. There was just a few MAGA types that were being confrontational and weird, very weird, kind of like in a high school bully way.
Oh gosh.
There was some guys that were doing some stuff, but it's just like, yeah, we've dealt with this our whole life,
Yeah.
So this is nothing new. Being a person of color, it's nothing new. We're used to it. It's not like it's okay though, but to behave in an intimidating way, that's not okay. But like I said, we're pretty used to dealing with that. But I just, when I got home and I brought some of the posters home from the GPAWS table, I just was like, I was filled with joy, even though I was exhausted too, because I was like, well, all of that stuff was free. And just thinking about all the people that took those posters and those stickers and the zine, and how a percentage of those folks are going to actually hang them up at home or in their office,
and potentially continue those conversations then with other people who see the artwork and then engage. And
because so there's Moselle's, she does a lot of the graphics for Great Plains, and her artwork is just incredibly beautiful and powerful. And there's some other artists too, like Christine Nobis too does a lot of the graphics too, like
you said, it's kind of sticks with you
in
a different way when there is symbolism and representation and kind of visual cues and reminders for us to continue engaging.
Yeah, and it inspires those conversations. It inspires like, looking at things from a different viewpoint. And that's the power that it holds.
With that, I want to talk about your work as an artist and your artwork, how your artwork has contributed to shifting these narratives around agriculture and social and environmental justice. So can you tell us about the trajectory of your visual artwork and how it has been informed by Meskwaki traditions and values? You told me since kind of the beginning.
Yeah, really, from the beginning of the time that I started doing art really young. I always loved drawing and writing in a lot of crafts, like always since I can remember. Every once in a while, I'll come across something that has been saved since I was a little kid. And quite often it's just, there's reflections on how much I love my family and the pets, but also just like, the flowers and the trees and, just this my little neck of the woods and how much like I just really loved, my world. Um and the same thing with the artwork. Starting from an early age, I also was really fortunate to have spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who I learned how to bead from. And so studying, her beadwork and her handiwork and her designs and being immersed in that type of, so it's a stylized representation of the natural world. And Meskwaki are a woodlands culture. We're a northeastern woodlands culture. So a lot of our applied arts is really based in, botanical. It's inspired by botanical imagery. And so that's just kind of something that I was immersed in as a kid, and, grew up in, always seeing this. There wasn't like any intentional indoctrination. This is just our culture. This is our way of life.
Right.
This is our decorative arts, which are not only decorative, but that have, a social, cultural, social, spiritual, you know, it's all in there. It's all a part of it. So when I decided to become a visual artist, when I was a student at Iowa State, first off, like I was really fascinated with architecture. And by the way, I'm still a builder. I have that kind of engineering type brain who's, problem solving and building and, figuring out how to do things. But, first I, coming from a small public school and then going to a university like that, I really struggled with the math and the sciences to get good enough grades in order to make it into the program. Even though I was like a stellar student in math and sciences in high school. But you can think of it this way, in the smaller schools compared to like, West High over in Iowa City, or Dowling and, over in Des Moines, or even Ames High, right? Once I got to college, I felt like I had missed, at least a couple of grade levels in math and sciences, going into those courses. And the other thing was just financially. I came to understand that there was no way financially I could afford to pursue the architecture program or even the graphic design program. Like I didn't have the money for the projects and none of that, and or even like a lot of the supplies. And I always loved painting and drawing. And so, my mother is the one that encouraged me to just, to study that. Like, you've always been an artist, just like do that, So that's what I did instead of dropping out of school.
Yeah.
And, because I figured like if I can just get my bachelor's degree, then the rest of my life is just going to follow suit. And I did learn once I did finally get my bachelor's degree that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
There is no job waiting for you. That's like a whole social strata and money and connections and stuff that you have. Not only do you not know how to navigate it, like you don't have an entry point into the professional class, like because you didn't come from it. Like you have no introductory, there's no doors open for you. It's always an uphill battle. But like with the arts, especially now that I look back on these older pieces that I was doing, when I was, even before I was like 20 years old, they were very much influenced by the decorative arts of the Meskwaki, very much influenced by, my relationship with the Iowa River, my relationship with the woods, and even thinking about trees and roots. I don't have the painting that has these people that like are their torsos are basically coming out of tree trunks,
Yeah.
and they're pierced by, these huge thorns. Well, out here we have the honey locust and the black locust, and so even being around those trees with these gigantic thorns and, just the idea of this human being integrated into this tree and also pierced by it and all these other things that were coming out, is just like, that was like just my upbringing caused me to reflect on how, that interconnectedness, right? And even, the animistic qualities of all life. And kind of like, if you look at the painting behind you, these frog men are hanging out in the woods, and trying to explain that is really hard. Like, some people look at it and they just get it, and because I can't even explain it in a way.
That's why it's visual art.
Yeah.
Right? It's because it inspires a feeling, like you were talking about earlier, of interconnectedness, and makes us think about these social connections we have and how it's connected to the environment and how that's part of this larger narrative. That it sounds like for you, when you're talking about narratives around exploitative colonialist cultures and how that ends up like seeping into all of our lives, in our newspaper stories and our interactions with people, in our economic systems and our social systems, right? But it sounds like what you're describing too is this sense of interconnectedness and relationship with the environment seeps into your artwork and the stories that you have been telling for a long time.
Yeah, into everything. It's a sensibility.
Yeah.
And like that painting, I can't explain it, actually. So it's these two frogmen, and they are in the woods. It's twilight, and one of them is standing and pointing to the sky. The other one is sitting, and the sitting frogman has a beer in one hand and a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. But he's chill. He's sitting there and he's listening. And the other one pointing to the sky, like, in a way, the one pointing to the sky, what he's doing, he's telling a story. He's storytelling. And these two dudes, why are they frogmen? For me, I wasn't like thinking this out conceptually. This just came out. But now when I reflect on it, I understand who I was portraying is Indigenous people. And the fact that they're kind of the anthropomorphized. I have trouble saying that word. Like, I can see it in my head written, and I know what it means, but this is basically what I'm doing, but not in a cartoon way. It's just like these dudes are of the woods.
Yeah.
But yet, like with the cigarette and the beer, that those are symbols of colonization. But still, the one storytelling is the one that is maintaining that oral tradition that keeps them indigenous, right? Instead of completely and totally assimilated, not in just how they dress and what they drink and smoke, but also in the way, their sensibilities and the way they think about life on Earth and community and, and even, on that spiritual plane, how they relate. And so those oral traditions and that storytelling is what, it's funny, they're frogmen, but at the same time, like from an Indigenous perspective, it's what keeps us human.
And you have not only incorporated these narratives and sensibilities in your visual artwork that you share with people and continue to kind of show, not just tell, but show what a different relationship with the environment could look like than the one that has overtaken so many of our economic and social systems. But you've also incorporated a lot of this kind of oral storytelling in your advocacy work. I know you told me that you intentionally integrate personal narratives and traditional storytelling with historical and cultural information when you're giving talks about rematriation and food sovereignty. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how storytelling is an important technique that you use?
Yeah, storytelling is really important. And, in the past, I have had like PowerPoint presentations, and I have found those incredibly ineffectual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because you are talking at the audience, you're not engaging with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when I'm asked to speak to an issue, I approach it as an assignment. I do prepare, and I do take some notes. Sometimes I'll just have some notes in a notebook. Sometimes I'll put them in a couple of just brief notes. Sometimes it's like I can't remember certain words or terms
Mm-hmm.
right off the top of my head, or as well as like numbers, such as, statistics, stuff like that. So I'll have these prompts and these little notes, but I don't go off like a set presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because like a lot of it is spontaneous, where, I look out at my audience and, I think about like, who are these folks that I'm engaging? I'm not talking at them, I'm engaging. Where are they coming from? What are their life experiences? And then two, it's just like, what do they want to hear from me?
Mm-hmm.
And so some of it's spontaneous, but very much like there has to be that historical reference, because, history has not only been whitewashed, it has been like so bastardized.
Yeah.
If, we just went through Thanksgiving, and even like the story of Thanksgiving was just cooked up in post-Civil War
Mm-hmm.
to create unity in the United States. And it was only like, very marginally based on the true history
Mm-hmm.
of that relationship with the Eastern indigenous folks, and the Puritans and the colonists, the early colonists, right? Storytelling does need a historical context.
Mm-hmm.
It has to have that element, and then tie that into how that relates to our contemporary issues.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this is the issue from the very beginning, and it's still going on. And then trying my best, and I am definitely not Jonathan Buffalo, who's our tribal historian. Like, nobody is. Like, he's devoted his life to this.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I've learned from him. I've done my own reading, my own studying of Meskwaki history, and it's an ongoing. I am a learner. I don't consider myself learned.
Right.
I consider myself a learner, including of the language. But I do draw from what I know and what I understand to be, and just try my darndest to then share that perspective with the audience, to inspire them to see these issues through the indigenous lens.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just not going to naturally happen. The dominant narrative is pushing quite the opposite direction.
Right, right. So you're talking about how to incorporate history and the importance of history in these contemporary narratives, and to bring an Indigenous lens and to really amplify Indigenous narratives around agriculture and social systems and economic systems and our relationship with the environment, and how it's really important to get these narratives into our conversations as much as we can. And one way that I know that you're doing this now is through a collaboration on an ag arts play with Mary Swander called Squatters on Red Earth. Can you talk a little bit about this play and how y'all have tried to tell a historical story while taking into consideration contemporary conversations around agriculture and social and environmental justice?
Well, knowing that the history of the relationship between the Meskwaki and the Amana inspirationalists, what little I do know,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of this is just family narratives that have been passed down. like my peers are all, pretty much they're all Generation X.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of my peers would talk about their grandparents going to the Amanas with their grandparents to visit friends there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the generation before would hitch up, the horses to the wagon, and it would be a 2-day trip. And there were farmers on the way where the Meskwaki had relationships where they would camp on their land overnight, and then, because it's like it's roughly, like to Main Amana, it's roughly about, a 1-hour car drive from here. So, but with a team of horses and wagon, that's about a 2-day trip. And then just learning about, that there were long-standing friendships in, my grandparents and great-grandparents era.
Mm-hmm.
And then great-great-grandparents, basically, from, when the Amanas settled there. And then I just was always amazed that there's just a complete amnesia in the contemporary Amanas. Because I'd visit the Amanas from time to time, either to go, well, they used to have a lot more kind of little festivals and stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
And two, I was just interested, like, who are these Amana people? Like, they used to have a friendships with the Meskwaki. They used to have like a kind of mutually, because of their communal way of life, they saw in each other's cultures so many similarities.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, like the same sensibilities that set them apart from, the dominant culture.
Mm-hmm.
And also that they wanted to maintain that way of life and those social structures rather than be assimilated into, ultimately, American individualism. But in current times, it's just like when I did talk to people from the Amanas, like nobody even was aware that there used to be this close-knit relationship with the Meskwaki, and that actually the Amanas was Meskwaki land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, still is,
right?
Like I said, with the land back movement, it's like this is native land, and many other indigenous folks, like the land acknowledgements. That's the thing with land acknowledgements, is that it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
There's many people over the course of thousands of years, that have stewarded this
Mm-hmm.
land prior to colonization, many different groups of people. But so it's just that fascination that there was these, recognition of similar cultures and sensibilities, and which inspired these two groups to have friendships. And especially in the old pictures of Meskwakis from the turn of the century, there's so many of those photos. The Meskwakis have the Amana blankets wrapped around them from the woolen mill. And they loved those blankets from the woolen mill. And so it was a trade relationship too. And so when Mary, I don't even know how this started, because Mary Swander, I can't even remember, because Mary Swander and I, we've known each other for around 35 years. She was one of my professors, creative writing instructor at Iowa State University. I think Mary, saw this grant opportunity, and it's just like, it kind of, things have just fallen into place. And I think it was, I suggested writing, basing the play on that history, that relationship, the relationship of these settlers that wanted to live apart from the larger American culture, and this native community that had tenaciously resisted assimilation. And that's just interesting. It's exceptional.
Yeah. So we've talked about how narratives around climate change have to address the ramifications, historical and present, of colonization and white supremacy and extractive relationships with the land and each other, and how in a lot of ways in this play, both the Meskwaki and the inspirationalist were trying to fight against some of these forces. This play is going to go on tour. It's a puppetry play, right? And you're designing the scenic design for it and the cranky and everything, which I'm very excited to see. What conversations around these topics do you hope emerge from the play when it goes on tour?
One of the things is that it's showing a different narrative,
Yeah.
right? It shows these conditions that, at least for a time, brought people together in, two very different groups of people together in a friendly relationship, and even how that was a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah.
And so it shows a model of the potential for understanding and respect between two different groups of people, founded on, founded in their commonalities, founded in, their belief systems, but especially these social structures that are very important to them, and that they really wanted to maintain. So Mary enlisted me as consultant, and one of her main priorities was to approach this project and, collaboration with the Meskwaki, and learning this narrative, telling this story in a good way, in a way that isn't extractive, in a way that isn't cultural appropriation, which is the standard. And Mary did not write the play from an Indigenous perspective because she's not Indigenous.
Right.
She wrote the play from the perspective of the inspirationalists, informed by, the Meskwaki historian, with that historic perspective put in there. I'm excited about it. I'm excited to see it come together, and especially how it comes together. There's going to be a matinee and then an evening performance here, actually in Toledo, which is a town very close to the Meskwaki Settlement, at the Weeding Theater. And so that production is going to include students from Meskwaki Settlement School that are in the drama club.
Oh, very cool. The play is going to be ready to be toured, and people can book the play to come to their communities, right? Starting this summer. So people should be on the lookout for that. And I know that this play and kind of the topics you're talking about are connected to what you've told me you want to do with your work kind of moving forward in the coming years. You said you want to focus your artistic and advocacy work on rematriation, including restoration of the bison, of the prairie, and of Indigenous agricultural leadership. So how do you hope to use artistic and storytelling techniques to work towards such a future and to help us envision such a future?
It's one thing to identify what's wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And it's one thing to identify what's broken and what needs fixing. But it really takes, folks with a creative vision that think outside the box, that also make connections, who, or even folks that love history, that love storytelling, that loves, just wants to learn, well, what the heck was going on in the Manas when they settled there? And what is this relationship? It's like, I want to know what makes this tick, and how does this reflect on our current relationships in our communities, and how they're structured. I mean, it takes, that's where the art is, that's like where the art lives, is because, to show the vision of a future, that can be beautiful, that can be based in community, that can fulfill that need for connection with each other. And when you're connected, you can trust each other. We have a society now that's getting so increasingly like fearful and violent, that like these mass shootings are just, oh yeah, another mass shooting. Yep. It's just, now it's normalized, isn't it?
Yeah.
And even when it happens in your community, what happens? It just picks up, and then the next day, everything just continues the same. And all of this, it's not, It's not going to be saved by one play. It's not going to be turned
No.
around
Yeah, no.
by one poster. But there does need to be like an alternate narrative to the dominant narrative, because the dominant narrative is to maintain the status quo.
Right.
And the status quo is killing us.
Yeah. And as we're talking about shifting these narratives, policy plays a big role in this. Do you see arts and storytelling playing a role in pushing for climate policy, for land back, food sovereignty policy?
Yeah, we don't have billions of dollars to line the pockets of legislatures and governors and, and, utility boards or, whatever. Like, we don't. That's the corporate model of creating and maintaining policy that maintains the status quo. But what we do have is we do have our creativity. We have our imaginations. We can envision alternatives to this. And the more that we, step away from the distractions of modernity, and especially just that hamster wheel of consumerism and even like basing the value of our lives on how productive we are and how much like we, achieve or, in those hierarchical systems, and even like, driving a better car,
right?
Being able to afford designer goods, buying your way into the next class system. All of that is a distraction, and the more that we turn away from that and then turn into this of rebuilding culture.
Yeah.
Because like, big ag in Iowa is not agriculture, it's agribusiness.
Right.
It's corporate agribusiness. And it is not agriculture. So local foods, food sovereignty, rematriation is bringing the culture back into our food systems. Iowa imports, once again, like, close to 90% of the food that we consume. We are not America's breadbasket.
No. Yeah.
We are producing.
That is the narrative we tell.
Yeah, that's the narrative, but it's a false narrative. We aren't. A few years ago, I took the soil short course before the PFI conference, and in talking about the history of the soils of Iowa and how there's very few other places in the entire world that had soils like Iowa had before it was settled by Europeans. And now it's just like, commodity farmers are dependent on heavy chemical use in order to get anything to grow.
Right.
And that's just insane. It's like, it's such huge cost. I was born in Iowa. I grew up here. I grew up in rural Iowa. I have seen over the decades, the effects on our rural economy and our communities of the farm crisis. And it's just like, suggesting any alternative seems to be, sacrilege.
But that's what we have to do, right? We have to figure out strategies for suggesting alternatives and then pursuing them, which it sounds like is what, you're talking about, and a lot of people on this podcast series are talking about, is how can we propose alternatives in a way that really engages people and engages communities and helps move toward actually pursuing those alternatives.
Another one of my professors, this is a photography professor, said that, why do we have the humanities? We have the humanities because it teaches us how to be human.
Right.
Now, current times, the humanities, the arts are more important possibly than ever in human history.
I think I would agree with that. And with that, I actually want to, as we're nearing the end of the interview. With that in mind, what are the 3 key ideas that you want people to understand about your work in the arts and humanities?
For one thing, when I was a student in Iowa State, I really struggled with spending all of that time, energy, and money studying art.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, my primary medium was painting. And I was just like, what's the purpose of all of this? You know, I had this creativity in me and I wanted to express it and I wanted to develop it further. At the same time, I'm just like, what is the use of all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how is this going to plug into, basically the corporate machine?
Mm-hmm.
The idea of, you graduate from high school, you get your college degree, and then you get a good job, right? And then you live the American dream. And I really thought that.
Yeah.
I didn't know any better. I very quickly learned that there really wasn't a place for me. And so I had to, in order to just continue to invest in this and to keep at it, I really had to think about what is the value of art. And it's just because the world needs artists, right? We are the storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of process that mythology. I'll read this quote for any creative person out there that I would like them to, I guess, internalize in a way. A way of thinking of their role in society is this: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. That's a quote that I read today. That's Margaret Mead. I may be a small person in a very big world, and I may be a dissenting voice in this extremely powerful and quite often violent dominant narrative. But a life well lived is a life that's true to oneself.
Mm-hmm.
And that in whatever gifts that you were born with, that you are able to express your gifts in an authentic way.
Right.
And that's a life well lived.
My last question is, what is the biggest recommendation you have for others who may be looking for ways to use arts and storytelling to talk about climate change in Iowa agricultural communities?
The biggest recommendation is to invest in relationships. It may seem like a bit of a cliche, but find your people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that means you got to step out of your comfort zone. And you may have to leave some people, behind. With art, the model of the starving artist and, kind of like the artist alone in the room pumping out masterpieces or whatever. No, it's the so much, whether it was the, expressionists or the impressionists, and of the, Western art, all these different art movements are based in community. One of the things that I have been trying to get going for years, especially for our little rural communities, is third spaces.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have them. So underserved communities, which also include rural communities, we do not have third spaces. So out here in the sticks, as well as in the city, any of the underserved communities, just, we're impoverished in that way. And so, artist collectives, and even just I don't know, heck, support those little cafes or coffee shops, or form them, where you have third space to go.
Right.
Where even if you just bring your laptop and sit in a corner, you're still in community. Like, you know, that barista,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and you're not paying into corporate profits. You're paying into this, you know, small business whose owners live in that community. But ultimately,
Exactly.
like, you know, local, small. But there's a huge need for it. And we need to rebuild that. It's just like none of us can create or operate in a vacuum.
Mm-mm. Well, speaking of which, how can people connect with you and your work?
So I am a board member of Great Plains Action Society. Contacting and supporting Great Plains Action Society is a good start because we're a little community that we're supporting each other in this work that we do. And a lot of times it's nice to have folks contact you through an organization rather than just always having, the biggest thing is like folks having access to me as an individual. It's hard.
Yes.
Because like as a Meskwaki woman, I always have to think about the potential for extraction. Let's say Great Plains Action Society as well as like Ag Arts.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and stories and all of the incredibly insightful experiences and strategies that you've used to talk about climate action and justice and our food systems. Thank you for listening to The Art of Climate Dialogue, and we hope you'll listen to the rest of the series. More information about podcast interviewees is available at ecotheaterlab.com. We invite you to engage in conversation with us by leaving a comment, responding to the short feedback form in our show notes, and checking out the Eco Theater Lab's website. We want to thank all of the organizations and individuals who made this series possible. This project is funded by both a North Central Region Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program graduate student grant, which is supported by the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and a Johnson Center for Land Stewardship Policy Emerging Leader Award. Our podcast consultant is Mary Swander, our podcast musician is Omar Dakuk Mercado, and our podcast artist is Mosel Nita Singh. Our podcast land acknowledgement is adapted from text developed by Lance Foster and Sakawis Nobis, and from conversations with Shelley Buffalo. Rosie Marcoux-Rowe is our podcast editor, and I'm Vivian M. Cook, Community Engagement Director for the Eco Theater Lab and the Art of Climate Dialogue, podcast producer and host. Take care.